Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me tonight is Sean Blackwell. He's the author of Am I Bipolar or Waking Up, and I would like to at least personally consider this a sort of like an addition to what I was already doing with Seth Farmer, only from a patient's perspective or somebody with the actual diagnosis perspective rather than from the psychologist's perspective. But I do feel like the shows belong together and that everybody should be able to, should really, if they want a full overall picture, listen to this show, plus the gift of spiritual madness, as well as the other show I did with Seth Farber, I believe was, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now. My brain just went on me, but at any rate, folks, I think for an overall better picture to listen to all of it would be a fuller picture. And I also wanted to mention to people I just recently started a variety show which covers not just paranormal, but sports, movies, entertainment, politics, just anything that you can talk about. Pardon me. And I haven't got moved completely over there yet. And if you will excuse me 1 minute, I got the weather getting into my throat. And Sean, I do apologize for that. That hit me while I was talking.
No problem.
But at any rate, what I was going to say, I haven't got moved over there fully, and what I'm doing in the meantime is shows like this one that deal with variety and paranormal, or at least paranormal somewhere in it, or the possibility of it. I'm simulcasting both, so y'all could also hear this at www.talknowradio.com right now. And if you're in the chat room over there, you're going to be in the chat room here. If you're listening at YouTube or somewhere, you can always stop by paranormalpalace.com, I apologize, or talknowradio.com. And also you can learn more about Sean by going to his website, www.bipolarorwakingup.com, and I just got tongue-tied for a minute. At any rate, and also the call-in number if y'all want to ask questions is 832-632-7904, or you can stop by paranormalpalaceradio.com and jump in the chat room and just ask questions on there. And also underneath the chat room is my Skype username for people that want to ask questions on Skype. And for now, let me jump in here and let's talk to if I said Sean, I meant to say Scott, but if I said Scott, I meant to say Sean, because it just dawned on me, I may have said Scott by mistake a minute ago.
No, you didn't.
Okay, I just
Royce.
Must have imagined it.
Yeah, it's okay.
At any rate, let's get on to Sean here real quick. And, let's find out what this has been like for him. And Sean, I got to tell you, I would have loved to have read your book. If I'd known, I could have just downloaded it from your webpage. I was at your webpage. I saw the PDF format, Adobe logo, but I did not read the little thing that says download free. I looked at that and just said it must be available in PDF format, and I didn't pay attention until today. And then today I said, well, you know what? I could have downloaded that, and I was an idiot. But I did download it, and I do plan to read it. But I have talked to Seth about this, and I've myself had some small experience, not with bipolar or schizophrenia, but with hyperactivity disorder and ADHD, and other family members were similar. So I think I'm up to speed enough that you and me can still discuss this.
Sure. Go ahead.
So let's start this off by you telling everybody here a little something about yourself and, how you got started on this path. Usually I would say you didn't just wake up one day and find out you were, a ghost hunter or a UFO enthusiast. You probably knew that he had an interest over time. But in your particular case, could I honestly say that perhaps it was sort of like waking up and you were there, or should I say you were awake and then you were into the other reality suddenly?
Yeah, well, I guess back in 1996, I was going through some hard times with my career. I felt really shut down for like about 4 years, and I was I was working in advertising, and it just wasn't working out for me. And I was getting really frustrated, and so I took a self-help course called the Landmark Forum, which is a weekend course, about a 4.5-day course, but it's quite intense. It's quite psychologically intense. And to make a long story short, this course brought up a lot of issues for me, issues related to my career, my relationships with people, related to my mother, my family, a lot of stuff. And due to they had a particularly powerful meditation technique that they taught us, and within about 5 minutes of this meditation technique, I felt a punch in my chest, and I started crying over, basically over a scuba diving accident I had had a couple of months earlier. I had quite a serious scuba diving accident where I almost died. And so it was just a lot of stuff related to parts of my life, my career, the scuba diving accident. It all came out. And then after that, my senses changed. Everything got sharper. You know, I could see details and curtains I'd never seen before. I'd never noticed before. I could really hear the comb going through my hair. You know, when the lights went out, there was this beautiful blackness. I noticed the creaminess of the blackness in my bedroom. And I had this sort of ecstatic energy. And to make a long story short, it led me, I guess, after a few days of being really high like this, and of course I give the details of this in my book, but after a few days like this, on the last day of the course, I started to think that I had died. Because I felt so good. I felt like, well, I know everything I ever wanted to know, and I feel perfect. This must be like it is when you're dead. And next thing you know, I was like, oh, I died in that scuba diving accident. That's what happened, and this is all just preparing me for the next level. Like, I thought I was going to nirvana or heaven or something like that, and I was in sort of a middle world, like a type of purgatory, where people were preparing me to move on. And so I was just in another world, and to prepare myself to go on to heaven or nirvana. I didn't really know what was there, but I felt like I needed to prepare to meet God in my pure state. And that led me to basically being in a hotel ballroom where the course was, and I went into a ballroom next to the ballroom we were in, and I started to take off my clothes, and I felt like I needed to go to the bathroom, but I was afraid to pee. And in order to face my fears, I actually peed on the carpet in the hotel, and then got right down in it. Like I wasn't going to allow myself to be afraid of anything, even laying in my own urine, you know. So it was quite a powerful experience, and one that, of course, psychiatry would see as, you know, insanity, probably schizophrenia. People who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia have similar experiences. And when they took me to the hospital, they diagnosed me with, they said I probably had bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. That's what they told my parents. Okay?
Okay. Now, did they ever decide which one?
I didn't really give them a chance. And the reason was that I felt that the experience I was going through was entirely spiritual and very positive. And I didn't have a notion that what I was going through was any sort of mental illness. And so when the psychiatrists were coming at me and looking very analytical and cold, and the staff was treating me poorly, I just felt like they were idiots. I was just like, well, they don't know what they're doing, because I'm having some sort of a spiritual awakening here. You know, I feel like I'm connected to God in a way that I've never felt before. And these people just don't know what's going on. So I never really internalized what they had to say. They forcibly drugged me, because I wouldn't stop talking and stuff like that. And so they injected me in my leg, and I guess, I fell asleep. I think they gave me a tranquilizer. To this day, I don't know what they really gave me. And about 24 hours later, I woke up and I realized that I was still in the hospital and that this place wasn't helping me. And so I just told them, I said, look, I said, my name's Sean Blackwell. I had a powerful experience at this course I was at. It brought up feelings from a scuba diving accident I had. And I think I went through some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I just told them that flat out. And within a couple of days, they let me go home. And they really didn't push medication because I was in psychiatric emergency. They didn't set up anything like, oh, you need to see a psychiatrist or anything like that. I just felt like I told them what they wanted to hear. And then I went home and spent the next 5 to 6 months trying to figure out what happened. And I was quite sensitive for that 5 to 6 months. So that, for example, when I left the hospital, I still really wasn't sure about whether I was dreaming or what kind of reality I was in. But I knew that I needed to get out of that hospital in order to survive and maintain what I had sort of taken in through this experience, the sort of spiritual awakening side of it, as ugly as it seemed.
Right. Well, okay, did you actually take any meds at all during your hospital day during those 2 days?
I think I was forced to take tranquilizers. I really don't know what the drug was, but it didn't seem to have a very zombie-like effect on me. I've heard people say, they feel like a zombie when they're on antipsychotics and things like that. And I didn't have that feeling. I just had this feeling that I hadn't slept very well for the previous 4 or 5 nights, and I wanted to sleep, and that's it. And I really didn't feel much of an effect from the medications, and I don't know what it was. But when I did go home, I was very sensitive, and I didn't see people very much for the next 2 or 3 months, and I went back to work only about 5 months later. And I went back and just sort of went back to my normal life, okay? And didn't think at that point in 97, I didn't think that what I had been through had anything to do with mental illness. I told my parents, I said, I don't know what bipolar disorder or schizophrenia is. I don't know what mental illness is, but this isn't it. I had a spiritual awakening, and that's the way I saw it.
Which is one of the things about you that differed from some of the people that Seth had interviewed in his book, was that most of the people that he had interviewed were either unaware that there could have been a spiritual event going on until later, or even later once it was brought to their attention, still had doubts of it. So your case was probably not the norm from the cases that at least I've heard about to this point.
No, my case is actually quite rare, and I've talked to over 1,000 people with bipolar disorder online, or that have been labeled with bipolar disorder. I've also read Seth's book, and usually what happens is that eventually people just come to accept, well, 2 things happen. One is most people are having an experience that is bringing up more trauma, is a little bit more difficult to deal with, and it leaves them in the hospital for a longer period of time. I was only in the hospital for about 4 days. And what most people are going through is they're in the hospital for a longer period of time. They're being medicated more heavily, and they're starting to internalize the diagnosis, internalize what the psychiatrists are telling them, and they basically become convinced that they've got this mental illness and believe that they need a lifetime of medication. Maybe some of them do. But in my case, that was never the case. I just simply did not accept that at all.
So what do you suppose it was in your case that enabled you to see that you didn't need medication and that this was not what the doctors thought it was?
That's a good question. And I need to tie that in also, and we need to get to it so why am I doing this work now? Because at that point I just went back to my normal life for about the next 10 years, really. But what I've learned since is that, I had this break when I was 30 years old. Most people have a break earlier in life, like about the age of 21, 22, or maybe even earlier. And at this point in time, my personal development was strong enough that I could sort of hold my own opinions, hold my own feel for things against what everybody else is telling me. They might call it in psychological terms your ego structure. my ego structure was strong enough, or at least my self-esteem was strong enough, that I could just look at the psychiatrist and say, I'm sorry, but, at least internally, tell them I'm sorry, but that what you think is happening is not happening, And when people are younger, when this happens to them at a younger age, it's harder for people to do that because we tend to follow our authority figures. When the doctor says you're sick, That's one aspect. And then the other aspect is that I do think that my process was easier to work through because I didn't have a lot of trauma to deal with. A lot of people with bipolar disorder and especially schizophrenia, they've had more difficult family backgrounds. Maybe they've been bullied in school, things like that. And when people even have the more serious, deeply paranoid experiences, often that's related to things like sex abuse or physical abuse or not having a steady home life growing up, not having a steady family background. And I had quite a fortunate background. I had two parents that although I had a few issues, especially with my mom, I did have two parents that had a good, loving relationship, a loving marriage. I knew that they both loved me. And so I had a solid family structure and quite a healthy upbringing in compared to a lot of people. I consider myself quite fortunate. And I think that helped me sort of stand up to the system, if you will.
A lot of it probably has to do with your own personal, I think you mentioned it earlier, confidence. I know when I was a kid, I was constantly being called stupid boy this, stupid boy that, and I was always like, well, if I'm so stupid, how did I go from 5th grade to 7th grade? Because I was already, past the 6th grade level in academics. Pardon me, I apologize for that.
Okay.
But, similar, I think, to what you were describing, in other words, that you have an inner knowing, basically, that, well, what you're telling me isn't making sense.
Yeah. This didn't make sense. It was like I was in another world, one world, and they were in another, and they didn't understand where I was at. And I thinking about it, for the 2 years prior to this experience too, I had also been studying a little bit of New Age material and a little bit of Buddhism. And so I was sort of softening my vision of the nature of reality. I think I was a little more prepared for a more flexible interpretation of what's real and what's not. Right. So I didn't have a hard, fast, this is a real world materialistic view. I did have a little bit more of a spiritual orientation, although it wasn't fully developed.
So do you think maybe perhaps you were really an avid spiritualist or somebody avid about learning about spirituality, and that maybe that could have predisposed you to what happened?
I think so. When I was in university, I studied religions. I was raised Roman Catholic, but then when I went into university, I studied the world's religions and sociology of religion and things like that. But when I started in advertising, I took a break from all that. But in the recent years before this crisis, I had sort of gone back and started studying again. And I think it opened me up to the experience and opened me up to the ability to work through it as well, It
very well could be. And, from what I've read and what I've heard, you were really one of the few, and I've actually known a few people, maybe perhaps not with bipolar or schizophrenia, but say depression, that would be in complete and total denial. Like you said earlier, I've been told I have a chemical imbalance, and it doesn't matter if you can prove to them that it's never been proven. It doesn't matter that the doctor never, took a culture or drew blood or, ran any medical tests. They'll still swear they have a chemical imbalance that can be diagnosed solely by questioning.
Mm-hmm. And to give you an idea, at that point, I'd never even heard of a chemical imbalance. I'd never even heard the term at that point. Didn't know what it was.
I'll tell you what I did tell my wife about that is if a person does enough alcohol or enough, drugs or speed or uppers, downers, whatever, then I think it's possible that the said person could create a chemical imbalance that's drug or alcohol related because everybody knows that when the dopamine supplies the pleasure to your brain, and if you're getting it from other sources, your brain shuts down making it while it's getting from the alcohol and drugs, and that's describing to me a chemical imbalance right there.
Mm-hmm. And we have chemical changes in our brains all the time. I mean, these chemicals are shifting all over the place, and certainly there is something biochemical happening when someone goes into a crisis or schizophrenia or something like that. But what's important to remember is that the chemical imbalance theory is telling you that you've got a permanent imbalance that you've been born with that's unchangeable, and that gives you this illness for the rest of your life, which you need a lifetime of medications for, and there's just no science behind that at all.
That's exactly right, and I think I'm glad to hear you break it down better than what I was doing just a minute ago, because I think people need to know that there's a big difference between, well, I did some drugs, and for a while there, I maybe did have a chemical imbalance. I've been off for 2 years, and, I seem to be having pleasure pretty much like anybody else, and a big difference between that and, whoa, I've never come back to normal. What's going on here?
For sure.
But imagine even in your case, it was still a pretty frightening experience. Well, actually, in anybody's case.
This is part of it. I think that in order to heal, there's a certain amount of fear that you need to face. You need to face a fear of death. I've done quite a bit of research on this now, and there's an ego death that you go through that feels like you're really dying. And at one point, I felt like I was facing my own annihilation, and I was saying, okay, take me. Like, goodbye to my family, goodbye to everybody. I thought that by turning out a light switch in a hotel ballroom, I was going to be annihilating myself. And that's when the police grabbed me.
Yeah, I read that in the part of your book I did read before the show.
Okay.
I got about as far as the prologue, and that was the prologue, and that's about as far as I managed to go with it. But you did cover, the lights and the police with the handcuffs, right there. And even when you got to the hospital, I think you mentioned that you still felt like you were in heaven, at least at first.
Sure, I did. And it was only when they started being really mean that I thought, well, I don't think this is going to happen in heaven. I don't think so.
So, you checked yourself out of the hospital. Have you ever been back?
The only time I go back to the hospital is that my wife and I live in Sao Paulo, Brazil now. All of this happened back in Toronto 15 years ago. And I go back to the Hospitais das Clínicas here in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And my wife and I participate in a meeting on mental health, religion, and spirituality. And we've given 7 presentations there over the last year and a half. I've stepped away a little bit, but that's the only time I've seen a psychiatrist since my hospitalization, is to go in and participate in meetings and give presentations. I haven't had a relapse. I haven't had a meeting with a psychiatrist, and I haven't taken any medication on, psychiatric medication, just for headaches and things like that once in a while.
Right. Well, I forget if I read this on your website or saw it in one of your YouTube videos, but I seem to remember something about Brazil being important to your recovery. And could the reason be behind this, these meetings that you keep going to?
No, the meetings aren't for my recovery. The meetings are to educate the psychiatrists to the spiritual dimension of life, to be quite honest, and to propose potential research projects to happen in the hospital. So I'm not participating in any sort of therapeutic group therapy or anything like that. And to tell you the truth, Royce, the only reason I've written this book and the only reason any of this has happened is because, I went back to my normal life. It felt a little bit empty, to be quite honest, working in advertising, and I really did want to find a deeper spiritual calling. And for years it was sort of elusive, but I met a...
Sean, are you still with me?
Wonderful woman. I was on a trip in Peru, and I met a wonderful... Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Well,
can you hear me, Royce?
I can now, but for a minute or two there, I couldn't.
Okay. I don't know what happened.
I don't either, but you know how today's technology is.
Yeah, a little unpredictable.
Yeah.
But, I'll back up a little bit and say that, I went back to my regular life, but it was kind of lacking. I felt like something was missing, even though I'd gotten promoted in advertising and things were going well. I took a trip to Peru, and I met a wonderful woman there from Brazil, and we had the same birthday, and we clicked right away. And to make a long story short, about a year and a half later, we got married in Las Vegas. I was working in Las Vegas, and then eventually we moved to Brazil a few years later. And I've been here for about 10 years, here in Brazil for about 10 years. And it was here in Brazil that I have two nieces. My wife has two nieces. And in 2007, both of them went into crisis. And their crises weren't so different from my own. But they were both labeled with bipolar disorder. And so that's when I started to do more research into what was the difference between what happened to me and what was going on with my nieces. So that's where all this started.
Okay. Now, in your niece's case, do you think that they're going through something similar to yours, you say, or you say that theirs is different?
Theirs, in both situations, theirs was more intense and more difficult because they were younger. Her crisis. The first niece in April 2007, in her book, I call her Anna. She went into crisis at the age of 17 in April 2007, and we went and worked with her, but she was basically taken in by the psychiatric system and medicated, and her parents decided to go that way. I decided to do more research to figure out what was the difference between what happened to her and what happened to me, and after 4 months of research, when I felt like I was really ready to help her, her sister had her first crisis. So the two sisters had crisis 4 months apart. In the sister's case, Eliana, in my book, she came to us because she saw what happened to her sister, and she didn't want to be medicated for life. And she came to us, and she went in. She had 3 episodes, and we helped her work through 2. And then a year later, she had a few other smaller episodes, but in that whole time, since 2007, she's only been medicated for about 2 weeks, and she's doing great. She had the same sort of breakthrough that I did, but it was because we were there to help her work through her episodes, And that's the big message is that, we don't need to medicate these things in a lot of cases. We can help a person work through their psychosis as long as we give them a protective and very supportive, loving environment. People are able to get through. And there's research to back that up. I'm not just saying it. I mean, it happens.
Right. And I've heard about this research. And, but the fact that you found this successful with your nieces indicates that even though it was more intense, that it was still similar in as much as it was still a spiritual experience rather than a chemical or a mental disorder or something like that, in other words.
Exactly. I would describe it like maybe somebody threw me in, or God threw me in the psychic ocean and I sunk about 10 feet, but then I was able to swim back up to the top. And with my nieces, God threw them in about 45 feet and I had to go down and get them,
That's a pretty far little jump, so it sounds to me like their case was a lot worse than yours, a lot more intense.
Yeah, there was a lot more intensity, particularly with the older niece, Eliana, that we helped. And, she's in Europe now. She's a Brazilian, and she's in Europe now. She got a full scholarship from the government of France to do her master's degree. And we're really proud of her, and she hasn't looked back. I mean, she worked through her episodes, and they have not been detrimental to her life at all. She describes it the way I do. I think it was really the best thing that ever happened to me, and she thinks of it as the best thing that ever happened to her, as ugly and as scary as it was.
Well, yeah, but I've read articles on the internet in ancient times with the mystics that one of the things that they used to have about people that are becoming enlightened or filled with the Spirit or, whatever the case may be, is that first you will be disturbed and then you will be calmed or something to this nature. In other words, I forget where I read it. I wish I could find it again. Probably could if I'd spent enough time. But I'm just saying this is a common repeat scenario. In other words, from thousands of years back up to now, if you go looking through the religious material.
Yeah, and I think that it's a bit of an obstacle in sort of today's, you might say, New Age approach to spirituality. I think there's a lot of good stuff in the New Age, but people, when you talk about spiritual experiences today, from a sort of postmodern perspective, people tend to look at them as very positive experiences, peace. If you listen to Deepak Chopra, he always talks about like enlightenment as being a sense of peace and knowingness, and you're at peace with yourself, you know. And the truth is that in order to get to that peace, sometimes you need to go through some very disturbing moments, you know. It's not always easy, and in India they know full well that if you're going to practice intense meditation, you need a master with you, because if you try and do it on your own, you can get yourself into trouble, you know.
That is true. I have read that, and I guess what happens to you and your niece is a good classic example of the kind of trouble you can get into.
Oh yeah, I read too I don't know if some of your listeners out there have ever heard of Osho, Guru Rajneesh, I think his name was, and I read his autobiography, and you know, he went through a year where, you know, he basically describes himself as out of his mind, you know, and then he came back and settled in.
You know what? I was sitting here listening to you just now, and my mind clicked. I said I couldn't remember where I read it. I'd have to go back and double check it, but I think it just came back to my mind that I read that in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth about the being first disturbed and then calmed, or whatever the terminology was. I mean, you're talking a few years back when I read it, so I may be misquoting it, but the general conception is there.
Oh, okay. But yeah, it's completely true.
You might want to look up the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, because some of the things described in that may actually look familiar to you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Even in, you know, I'm not a big fan of Sigmund Freud, but, you know, one of his colleagues was asked, you know, after Freud did his own psychoanalysis, he analyzed himself, and people asked one of his colleagues, they said, so how is Freud, like, after this analysis he did on himself? Is he better? Is he worse? And they said, you know, the first year he did his psychoanalysis on himself, he was a lot worse. But then he got a lot better. You know, because imagine, you know, Freud, he had these Oedipus complex. He wanted to have sex with his mother and kill his father. I mean, how would you feel if one day you woke up and you realized that you wanted to kill your father and you have sex with your mother? You're going to be pretty disturbed, right? It's pretty screwed up. But then he sort of worked through that and got better, you know?
It's a wonder that he remained in psychiatry after doing that.
Yeah, even Carl Jung, who's gaining more and more popularity these days, he went through a period of schizophrenia in a sense, and the way he healed himself was he wrote a diary and did art in the diary, and in that diary he describes himself as being in constant conversations with entities that were basically in his own mind, or he described them as spiritual archetypes that he was interacting with, but that he saw as very real. And so the whole diary is him having conversations with what many people would think of as imaginary characters, and he saw as, you know, spirits, you know, and he'd have real dialogues with them. What are you doing here? You know, and that sort of thing. They call his book, his family didn't allow that book to be released until just 2009. The diary had been around for 30 years. They kept it in a vault, but in 2009 they released it. It's called the Red Book, and it really shows the depth of his spiritual adventures in order to heal himself from schizophrenia.
Yeah, and you know, I think it was Joseph Campbell, who George Lucas was a sort of a protege of, and George Lucas was talking about Joseph Campbell and his teaching of ancient mythology, and he was saying that this hero portrayal, like Hercules and, you know, the you know, things that he experiences and other characters of mythology, is sort of like mimicking a spiritual experience, kind of similar to what you're describing, in other words, and, you know, kind of like Luke's walk, for example.
Luke Skywalker?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, because there was a clinic where they helped people work through psychosis in San Francisco in the 1980s called Diabasis. I believe the name was Diabasis, and the doctor was Dr. John Weir Perry. And he knew Joseph Campbell. And the two of them got together, and Perry explained to Campbell what Dr. Perry was seeing when people go into psychosis. And Joseph Campbell said, well, this sounds just like the hero's journey, like the Luke Skywalker thing.
And it sounded to me, too, when you said what you said to me, so there must be something to it.
Yeah, it's like you enter into a sort of, when you're in psychosis, you sort of go into your own mythological world where you need to confront certain demons and then you need to come back. You know, that's sort of what's going on.
You need to kind of defeat your demons. You know, I think the Bible talks about it, not defeating the devil himself, but the works of the devil.
Yeah, I guess the difference is, I don't want to get people too stuck on the word devil, but...
well, I wouldn't either, but it was just something that come to mind.
Sure, no, it's kind of like the devil's in you, you know, like you're dealing with your own... But you're also dealing with your own angels, too, like... You know, one of the New Age things to say is that you are God, you know, and I think there's some truth in that. And many people, when they go into psychosis, they think that they're Jesus. You know, they think, oh my God, they're Jesus, and the reason is that they've gotten in touch with a sacred part of themselves. You know, there's something inside themselves that's sacred and pure and part of God, and they just make the mistake of thinking that they're the only one. Meanwhile, this God particle is inside all of us. But there's also, for most of us too, there's a certain demonic energy or a certain darker energy that's within us too that will need to be confronted in order to heal in a lot of cases.
Right. Now, okay, I apologize. I had a distraction there on my end.
Okay.
What I was going to mention, really quick, like if I can regain my place, was that, it's about that, well, I got a message from my wife just now, and when I read it while you were talking, it caused my mind to go blank, and I want to apologize for that. My son Royce is evidently running a 104-degree fever, and she wants to call him an ambulance, and was asking me to cut the show short so that the ambulance wouldn't interfere with the, show when they get here. And that's what caused me to forget what it was I was about to say. It had to do with your YouTube video. Oh, I remember now. Real quick, like before I actually ask you for the favor, I wanted to mention that I remember because I watched some of your videos. I watched about 8 or 9 of them.
Right.
That in one of them, I think it mentioned something to the fact that, unless I'm mixing you up with somebody else, it's had an experience of being like God and another experience of being like the devil. Or am I thinking of one of the cases I read in Seth's book?
No, I talk about that in detail. I've got over 20 videos on this subject, 20 slideshow videos, and some of those videos deal with the light and the godly part, the sort of heavenly nirvana that people feel and why they feel that way. But then I also deal with the dark part, which can also manifest itself in terms of paranoia, hallucinations. I get into the dark side too, and my advice to people, especially when we don't really have a lot of support networks up, I think that for people who are going through darker or more disturbing experiences, that it could be that the best option is medication at this point, because we just don't have enough educated support networks and support people around to help. But when people are having extraordinarily positive experiences, if they can just get a little support, I think it's possible for people with positive experiences to work through these things in an unmedicated way.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I know I definitely came out on top with my attention deficit disorder and my anger issues, and I've seen my son Royce do it as well.
Royce Jr.?
Yeah.
All right.
But at any rate, what I was going to say about this devil and Christ thing, because you made a mention it earlier about maybe the devil's in you, but maybe God and the devil are both inside of you. This is that duality, tree of good and evil thing that was mentioned way back in Genesis and by other mystics in different ways. And maybe these two have to come to terms on your way back up to the beginning.
That's a good point. And there's a doctor named Dr. Paris Williams, and he gave, in his new book, Rethinking Madness, he gave 6 case studies. And in all of those 6 case studies, people had issues related to good and evil, and in order to rectify the issue, they needed to sort of have the good and evil come to terms with each other. There was sort of a mutual integration of the good and evil, not the sort of splintering them off in one way or the other.
Which I was mentioning just a minute ago about you don't want to defeat the devil, you want to defeat the works, you want to integrate. It's a matter of what's in control.
Right, because if you're projecting the devil, what you're saying is, I'm not the devil, I'm not evil, it's this other people are evil, or the devil's trying to do things to me. You really got to sort of sit down and say, hey, I've got a dark side too, and I got to realize that, I've got my issues, I've got my dark side, and I've got to know that. And if you can see that the part of you that is kind of dark, then I think you're on the well on the way to healing,
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I would go into that in more detail, and I really hate to do this, especially with this being your first time on the show, and I've been coughing a lot on you tonight, which I usually have a problem with that, but not like tonight. It's been raining today, and when it rains, it gets worse, but at any rate.
No problem, Royce. No problem.
I would like it if you could, if you wouldn't mind doing a reschedule so we can get Royce on the way to ER.
Oh, Jesus. Okay, yeah. Sure, go ahead.
All right, I really do appreciate you working with me on that, and I'll be in touch with you on an email, and we'll redevote a show just for me and you, and then in the future we can bring Seth in if that's okay with you.
Okay, that's fine, and good luck with your son, huh?
All right, thank you, Sean. I really do appreciate it. Want to let you know, I thought we was really doing pretty well together in spite of my coughing and that. I thought that we had good chemistry going, and the show was up to now sounded pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, I think so too. And I've enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, you have a good night, and I do apologize, and I'll be looking forward to being in touch with you probably tomorrow or the next day.
All right. Later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.